At 7:42 p.m. on Christmas Eve, my mother-in-law placed a silver serving tray into my hands in front of 20 people and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Since you're a waitress anyway, you might as well be useful tonight." Everyone laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to make it clear that no one intended to stop her. My husband, Daniel Harper, didn't look at me. He just sipped his wine and said nothing. That was the moment I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. I wasn't a guest in this family. I was an employee without pay. And what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that within 12 months, every single person at that table would be forced to speak to me differently. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you've ever been treated like you didn't belong in your own family, if you've ever smiled through humiliation because you thought keeping peace mattered more than your dignity, stay with me, because what happened after that Christmas dinner changed everything. And I promise you this, the revenge I chose wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was far more devastating. Let me take you back to how it all began. My name is Rachel Torres. I'm 31 years old, and at the time this story started, I worked as a server at a mid-range steakhouse in Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous, not prestigious, but honest work. I made about $2, $600 a month after tips, enough to cover rent on a small one-bedroom apartment before I married Daniel. Enough to pay my car insurance and student loans from a community college hospitality program. Enough to live quietly without asking anyone for help. I wasn't ashamed of my job, but Daniel's family was. From the moment I met them, they treated my profession like a character flaw. Daniel's mother, Linda Harper, was a retired real estate broker. His father, Charles Harper, had spent 35 years as a regional bank manager. His younger sister, Melissa Harper, was an HR director at a corporate consulting firm. To them, identity came from titles, from prestige, from income brackets. And I had none of those things. I had an apron, a name tag, and a schedule that included weekends and holidays, including Christmas Eve. The first time Linda learned what I did for a living, she smiled politely and said, "Oh, so you're in food service." The way she said it made it sound like I had confessed to a crime. Melissa was less subtle. At a family barbecue 6 months before our wedding, she laughed and asked, "So what's the long-term plan? Or is bringing people water and refilling bread baskets your forever career?" I remember Daniel squeezing my hand under the table and whispering, "Just ignore her. She doesn't mean anything by it." But she did mean something by it. They all did. Because over time, the comments didn't stop. They just became quieter, sharper, more frequent. "Must be exhausting standing all day. I could never deal with customers like that. You're so sweet to work so hard for tips." Every word sounded polite, but each one carried the same message. You are beneath us. And the worst part wasn't their behavior. It was Daniel's silence. He never defended me, never corrected them, never told them to stop. His favorite phrase was always, "They don't understand your world." But what he really meant was, they don't respect it. And he wasn't willing to challenge them. Because in the Harper family, conflict was forbidden. Appearance mattered more than truth. And harmony was maintained by quiet compliance, which for years is exactly what I gave them. Until that Christmas Eve. The dinner was held at Linda and Charles's house, a large 2-story colonial in a gated suburban neighborhood. They hosted every year 20 to 25 guests, extended relatives, business associates, neighbors. Formal seating, fine china, wine pairings, everything carefully curated to project a specific image. The Harper family was successful, stable, respected, and I was there to complete the picture. Daniel had asked me weeks earlier, "Please don't work Christmas Eve this year. Mom really wants you there." So I switched shifts, lost about $300 in holiday tips, and spent 2 days helping Linda prepare desserts and side dishes, chopping vegetables, setting tables, polishing glasses, not as a guest, but as unpaid labor. By the time guests arrived, my feet already hurt. But I smiled, because I believed at that point that effort could earn acceptance. I believed if I worked hard enough, they would eventually treat me like family. I was wrong. Dinner began at 7:30. Everything looked perfect. Candles flickering, soft music playing, conversation flowing easily. For the first 15 minutes, no one made any comments. I almost relaxed. Then Melissa spoke. She lifted her wine glass and smiled across the table at me. "So Rachel," she said casually, "do you ever worry about job security? I mean, restaurants close all the time." A few people chuckled politely. I felt my face heat, but kept my voice steady. "I focus on doing my job well," I replied. "That's all anyone can really control." She smiled wider. "That's very practical." Then Linda stood up, walked to the kitchen, and returned, carrying a large silver serving tray. She placed it directly into my hands. "Right there, in front of everyone. Since you're a waitress anyway," she said with a light laugh, "you might as well help serve dessert." And that's when it happened. That moment at 7:42 p.m. The laughter, Daniel's silence, the weight of the tray in my hands, and something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. Because in that instant, I realized something that changed my life. They would never respect me while I remained in the role they had assigned to me. And if I wanted my life to be different, I would have to change the terms completely. But what I didn't know yet was that within 3 months, I would discover a secret about the Harper family. A financial secret. One that would reveal why they were so obsessed with status, why they feared instability so deeply, and why once I understood it, the balance of power between us would begin to change forever. Because sometimes revenge doesn't begin with anger. Sometimes it begins with information. And that Christmas Eve was only the first crack in a very carefully constructed illusion. I didn't cry that night. Not when I carried the dessert plates. Not when I cleared empty glasses while guests kept talking over me as if I were invisible. Not even when Melissa joked to a cousin, "Rachel's practically on payroll tonight." Everyone laughed again. Soft, polite, harmless on the surface. But humiliation rarely comes from one loud moment. It comes from 1,000 small ones. And that night, each one stacked quietly inside me. By 9:18 p.m., dinner was over. Guests began putting on coats. Linda thanked everyone for coming, her smile warm and effortless. And as they left, many of them handed me their empty plates automatically, without thinking, without asking, because in their minds, that was my role, not Daniel's wife, not family, service staff. The realization didn't break me. It clarified me. And clarity is more dangerous than anger. Because anger is emotional. Clarity is strategic. I helped finish cleaning the kitchen. Daniel finally spoke while drying wine glasses. "Mom didn't mean it like that," he said quietly. I didn't respond right away because I was tired of explaining things that should have been obvious. Instead, I asked calmly, "Did you notice that I didn't sit down to eat?" He froze for a moment, then said softly, "I'm sorry, but apologies without change are just maintenance tools. They keep the system running. They don't fix it." That night when we got home, I lay awake long after Daniel fell asleep, not replaying the humiliation, not feeling sorry for myself, thinking, because something had finally become clear. The Harper family didn't disrespect me because of who I was. They disrespected me because they believed I had no power. And in their world, power came from money, status, financial stability, which meant one thing: if I wanted to change how they treated me, I needed to understand exactly how their world worked. And that opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, Daniel asked me to help with something unusual. "Mom needs someone to pick up some paperwork from the bank," he said one Saturday morning. "I can't get off work, and she trusts you." The phrase "she trusts you" sounded ironic, but I agreed, because I had learned something important in my job as a server. People reveal the most when they think you're invisible. Linda met me at the branch lobby. She looked stressed, more than usual, which was surprising. because she prided herself on appearing perfectly composed at all times. "Thank you for coming," she said quickly. "I just need you to sign a pickup authorization form so you can collect the file for me." I signed without hesitation. But when the banker handed me the sealed envelope, I noticed something. It wasn't addressed to Linda personally. It was labeled Harper Family Trust, Financial Review Documents. Trust. That meant significant assets, estate planning, wealth management. It also meant confidentiality. Linda took the envelope from me quickly, but in that brief moment, I saw something else. A red stamp on the corner. Urgent Delinquent Status Review. Delinquent. That word didn't fit the image the Harpers projected. Because wealthy, stable families don't have delinquent trust accounts. At least not publicly. Linda noticed me looking. Her smile tightened slightly. "Just routine paperwork," she said lightly. But her voice lacked its usual confidence. And that was when the first crack appeared. Because perfect families rarely show fear, unless something is wrong. On the drive home, she was unusually quiet. Then, suddenly, she said, "You know, Rachel, financial stability is everything." I glanced at her. "Why do you say that?" She sighed. "Because once it's gone, people treat you differently." The words surprised me. Because for the first time since I had known her, she sounded vulnerable, almost worried. That moment planted a question in my mind. A question that wouldn't leave. What if the Harper family's obsession with status wasn't about superiority? What if it was about fear? The answer came 3 weeks later, completely by accident. I was working a lunch shift at the restaurant. Busy, tables turning quickly. The kind of day where you move constantly without thinking. Around 1:12 p.m., a new party was seated in my section. 2 men in business suits. One older, one younger. They were deep in conversation when I approached. I introduced myself, took their drink orders, and stepped back. But then I heard a familiar name. "Harper Family Trust," the older man said quietly. My heart skipped. I kept my expression neutral, continued refilling water glasses at a nearby table, listening without appearing to listen. "The problem," the younger man continued, "is that they leveraged too much real estate equity before the market downturn." Leverage, real estate, downturn, financial distress. "Their trust assets are technically insolvent," the older man said. Insolvent. That word landed like a quiet explosion in my mind. Insolvent meant one thing. They owed more than they owned. It meant the Harper family's wealth was largely an illusion, built on borrowed money, sustained by appearances. At risk of collapse, I stood perfectly still for a moment, because suddenly everything made sense. Their obsession with status, their rigid control, their constant need to project stability. It wasn't arrogance. It was survival. They weren't protecting wealth. They were protecting the image of wealth. And that image was fragile, very fragile. I finished serving their table without reacting. But inside, something had shifted again. Because now, I understood something powerful. The Harper family didn't hold all the power. They held a performance. And performances can be dismantled quietly, strategically, with the right information. That afternoon, I sat in my car after work, hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking, not about revenge, about leverage, because power doesn't come from anger. It comes from knowing what others are afraid of losing. And now, I knew exactly what the Harper family feared most: exposure. What I didn't know yet was how soon that fear would collide with reality. Because within 6 months, a single financial decision would force them into a position they never expected. A position where they would need help. And the only person capable of helping them would be the same woman they once handed a serving tray on Christmas Eve. Me. For weeks after overhearing that conversation, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't change my behavior. Because information only becomes power when you use it correctly. And using it too early destroys its value. So I did what I had always done best. I watched, quietly, carefully, and the more I observed the Harper family, after that day, the more cracks I began to see. Small ones at first, subtle, almost invisible. But once you know where to look, you can't unsee them. It started with Daniel. He had always been relaxed about money, careful but not anxious. But suddenly, he began checking our joint bank account daily. I noticed him comparing credit card statements late at night, calculating expenses, canceling small subscriptions we'd had for years. One evening, while we were folding laundry, he said casually, "Maybe we should hold off on replacing the car this year." That alone wasn't strange. But then he added, "Just in case things change." Things change. That phrase lingered in the air, because Daniel never spoke vaguely about finances. He was precise, logical, predictable, which meant he knew something, or suspected something. A week later, Linda canceled the annual New Year's brunch she hosted every January. Her explanation sounded harmless. "We're keeping things small this year." But that event had been a tradition for 20 years. It wasn't something she would cancel lightly. Then came Charles. He stopped playing golf at his country club, claimed he was cutting back on unnecessary expenses. Unnecessary expenses from a man who once insisted status was built on consistency. Each change on its own meant little. But together, they formed a pattern of financial contraction, of quiet panic, of trying to maintain appearances while reducing costs. And every time I saw these signs, I remembered the word stamped on that envelope. Delinquent, insolvent. The Harper family wasn't wealthy. They were balancing on the edge. What I didn't understand yet was how close they were to falling. That answer came in February, in the most unexpected way. It happened on a slow Tuesday afternoon shift, around 3:07 p.m., when the lunch rush had ended and only a few tables remained. The hostess waved me over. "Rachel, there's someone asking for you." I frowned. No one visited me at work without calling first. I walked toward the entrance, and there she was, Linda Harper, standing stiffly near the door, looking uncomfortable, almost nervous. I had never seen her look nervous before, not once in 10 years. "Linda," I said gently, "is everything okay?" She forced a smile. "Yes, I just needed to talk to you." Her voice was unusually quiet, not commanding, not dismissive, careful, which meant something serious had happened. I led her to a corner booth, offered her water. She sat down slowly, hands folded tightly in her lap. Finally, after a long pause, she said, "We're selling the house." The words stunned me. The Harper house wasn't just a home. It was their symbol, their foundation of identity, their proof of stability. "You're moving?" I asked softly. She nodded. "We have to." Silence stretched between us. Then she whispered something that changed everything. "The trust is failing." There it was, spoken out loud for the first time. Not a rumor, not speculation, reality. She continued quietly. "Your father-in-law invested heavily in commercial real estate 5 years ago. When interest rates rose and occupancy dropped, everything collapsed faster than we expected." Her voice trembled slightly. "We've been restructuring for months, trying to avoid losing everything." Everything. The word carried enormous weight, because losing the trust didn't just mean financial loss. It meant social collapse, loss of status, loss of identity, loss of the image they had spent decades protecting. I listened without interrupting, because for the first time, Linda wasn't speaking to me as someone beneath her. She was speaking as someone vulnerable. Then she said something I never expected. "We need help." I blinked. "Help with what?" She hesitated, then explained. Charles had co-signed several property loans. Now, creditors were demanding accelerated repayment. They needed liquidity, fast, but most of their assets were tied up in illiquid holdings, properties that couldn't be sold quickly without massive losses, which meant they needed cash flow, immediate reliable cash flow. She looked at me, eyes full of something I had never seen in her before. Not pride, not superiority, desperation. "Daniel told me your restaurant is owned by an investment group," she said quietly. "They're expanding locations, right?" I nodded slowly. "They are." She swallowed. "We need introductions." The request hung in the air. heavy, because she wasn't just asking for business contacts. She was asking me to bridge a gap between two worlds, her world of collapsing prestige and my world of practical working relationships. The irony was overwhelming. For years, she had dismissed my job as insignificant, and now that same job gave me something she didn't have: access, real-world connections, networks built on trust rather than status. I didn't answer immediately because this was the moment where everything shifted. Not emotionally, strategically. For the first time in our relationship, Linda needed something only I could provide. Power had quietly changed hands. Finally, she said softly, I know we haven't always treated you the way we should have. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was the closest she could come. And in that moment, I understood something important. Revenge doesn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it comes through reversal, through simply changing who needs whom. I looked at her calmly, then asked one question. If I help, what changes? She froze, because she hadn't expected that. She had expected gratitude or automatic compliance, not negotiation. But now, the rules were different. Because I wasn't the same woman who carried a serving tray on Christmas Eve. I was the woman holding the leverage. And she knew it. What she said next would determine whether I chose to help them or walk away forever. Because power isn't just about having options. It's about deciding how to use them. And I had just realized I had more options than they ever imagined. Linda didn't answer my question right away. She just stared at me across the booth. Because for the first time in our entire relationship, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't accommodating. I wasn't trying to earn approval. I was negotiating. And negotiation requires something she had never offered me before: equality. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. What do you want to change? Not what can we offer. Not what do you need. What do you want? That distinction mattered because it meant she understood something fundamental. The power dynamic had shifted. I folded my hands calmly on the table. I want respect, I said. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly. She nodded slowly. That's fair, but respect isn't a vague concept. It requires specific changes, concrete behavior. So I continued. No more jokes about my job. She nodded again. No more treating me like staff at family events. Her lips pressed together, but she nodded. And Daniel needs to defend me when someone crosses a line. That was the hardest condition, because it required not just her behavior, but his. She hesitated. Not long, but long enough to reveal something important. She knew that change would be difficult, because it would force Daniel to confront family norms he had followed his entire life. Still, she said quietly, I can talk to him. I held her gaze. No, I replied calmly. He needs to choose it himself. Because forced respect isn't real. It only exists when someone acts without being told. Linda studied me for a moment, then said something unexpected. You're stronger than I thought. It wasn't praise. It was recognition. The kind that comes when someone realizes they misjudged you completely. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I simply said, I've always been strong. You just didn't see it. Silence settled between us. Not tense, not hostile, just honest. Finally, she took a breath. If we agree to these changes, will you help us? That was the moment, the true turning point. Because I could say no. Walk away. Let them face the consequences of their own choices. And for a brief second, I considered it. Because part of me remembered every humiliating comment, every silent dinner, every moment Daniel had failed to speak up. But revenge, driven by anger, is short-lived. Revenge, driven by clarity, is strategic. And clarity told me something important. Helping them wouldn't restore their power. It would redefine it. It would place me in a position they could never again ignore. So I said calmly, yes. Her shoulders relaxed instantly, relief washing over her face. For the first time, she looked less like an authority figure and more like someone deeply afraid of losing everything. Because status isn't just about wealth. For people like Linda, it's about identity, and losing it feels like losing yourself. The process moved quickly, faster than I expected. Because the restaurant group that owned our location wasn't just expanding. They were aggressively acquiring distressed commercial properties. Exactly the kind of assets the Harper Trust was struggling to maintain. Within 2 weeks, I arranged an introduction between Charles and the group's regional acquisition director. Not because I had financial expertise, but because in the service industry, relationships matter more than titles. The director trusted me. I had served him lunch twice a week for 3 years. He knew my reliability, my professionalism, my discretion. And that trust opened doors Charles's prestige no longer could. Negotiations began quietly. The Harpers agreed to sell several underperforming commercial properties at losses, but enough to stabilize their cash flow, enough to avoid default, enough to protect what mattered most to them: their home, their reputation, their sense of security. For the first time in months, the crisis began to ease. And with that change, their behavior towards me changed too, subtly at first, but unmistakably. Linda began calling me by my first name instead of Daniel's wife. She asked about my work without condescension. Charles thanked me personally for facilitating the introductions. Even Melissa stopped making jokes, though her silence carried more resentment than acceptance, because she understood something clearly. The hierarchy had shifted, and she hated losing her position above me. But the most important change came from Daniel. One evening in March, he came home, unusually quiet, sat beside me on the couch, and said something I had waited years to hear. "I should have stood up for you." The words were simple, but heavy, because they acknowledged something he had avoided for a decade. He wasn't ignorant of the disrespect. He had chosen not to challenge it. I didn't rush to reassure him, didn't say it was okay, because accountability only matters when it isn't softened. Instead, I asked calmly, "Why didn't you?" He hesitated, then answered honestly, "I thought keeping peace mattered more than confronting them." There it was, the belief that had shaped his behavior for years. Peace at any cost, even dignity, even fairness. I nodded slowly, and now he looked at me steadily. "I understand that peace without respect isn't peace." That sentence changed everything, because it showed growth, real growth, not words meant to avoid conflict, but understanding born from consequence. He reached for my hand. "I want to do better." For the first time in years, I believed him, not because he promised change, but because circumstances had forced him to see reality. And reality changes people in ways words never can. By early summer, the Harper family's financial crisis had stabilized. Not resolved, but controlled. They had lost assets, lost prestige, lost the illusion of invulnerability. But they had kept what mattered most to them. And they knew exactly who had helped make that possible: me. Yet what they didn't know was that my own life was about to change in a way none of them expected. Because the same connections I had used to help them were about to open an opportunity for me. An opportunity that would shift the power balance permanently. An opportunity that would ensure I would never again be seen as someone replaceable. Because sometimes revenge isn't about taking something away. Sometimes it's about building something so powerful no one can ever diminish you again. And that opportunity was about to arrive in the form of a single conversation with the one person who had quietly observed everything. My restaurant's regional director. And what he was about to offer me would change my future forever. The offer came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2:17 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was wiping down table 14 after a late lunch rush when my manager, Carlos Mendoza, walked over with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not stressed, not rushed, serious. "Emily," he said quietly, "the regional director wants to speak with you." My first thought was simple. I was in trouble. Because in restaurants, when someone from corporate asks to see a server directly, it usually means a complaint, a mistake, a problem. And I had built my reputation on never having any of those. Still, my stomach tightened, as I followed him to the small office near the kitchen. Inside sat Richard Lawson, mid-50s, calm, observant, the kind of man who spoke softly and didn't waste words. I had served him coffee dozens of times over the years. He always tipped well, always remembered my name. But today, he wasn't here as a customer. He was here as someone with authority. He gestured for me to sit. I did. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. "I've been watching you for a long time." Not in a threatening way, in a professional one. He continued, "You're one of the most consistent employees we've ever had." I blinked, unsure where this was going. He leaned back slightly. "Customers request your section by name. You handle conflict calmly. You remember details. You build relationships." He paused, then asked a question that changed everything. "Have you ever considered moving into management?" For a moment, I couldn't speak, because the idea had never felt realistic. Not for someone like me. I had always seen myself as part of the floor staff, someone who supported operations, not someone who ran them. "I don't have a business degree," I said carefully. He smiled slightly. "Neither did I when I started." Then he leaned forward. "And degrees don't teach what you have." I frowned slightly. "What do I have?" He answered without hesitation. "Leadership." The word hit harder than I expected, because no one had ever used it to describe me before. Not my family, not Daniel, not his parents, not even myself. He continued calmly. "We're expanding into 3 new locations next year. We need assistant managers who understand people, not just spreadsheets." He paused, then said something that made my pulse quicken. "I want to offer you a training position." The room felt suddenly smaller, louder, because this wasn't a small opportunity. It was a path out of the role that had defined how everyone saw me. "How long is the training?" I asked quietly. 6 months, he said. "Paid. Full-time. After completion, you'd move into an assistant manager role." My mind raced, because this wasn't just a job change. It was a shift in identity, in income, in status, in power, and most importantly, in how my in-laws would see me. But beneath that thought was a deeper one. Did I want to accept it for the right reasons, or just to prove something? He must have sensed my hesitation, because he added quietly, "You wouldn't be doing this for us. You'd be doing it for yourself." That sentence settled something inside me, because he was right. This wasn't revenge. This was evolution. So I asked the only question that mattered. "What happens if I say no?" He smiled gently. "Nothing changes." Then he added, "But if you say yes, everything might." I asked for 2 days to think, not because I doubted the opportunity, but because I needed to process what it meant. That evening, I told Daniel. We were sitting at the kitchen table. He listened quietly, then said something that surprised me. "I think you should do it." No hesitation, no defensiveness, just support. I studied him carefully. "Even if it means longer hours, less time together at first," he nodded. "You've spent years supporting everyone else. It's time something supported you." For the first time in a long time, I felt completely seen by him, not as someone to protect, not as someone to manage, but as someone capable. And that mattered more than the promotion itself. Telling his parents was different. We invited them to dinner that Sunday. Nothing formal, just a casual meal. After dessert, I shared the news. The reaction was immediate. Linda's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Management, not skeptical, but clearly unexpected. Charles leaned forward slightly. "That's impressive." And then came the moment I will never forget. Melissa, who had spent years mocking my work, said nothing. For once, she just stared, because she understood something instantly. If I moved into management, the narrative she had built about me would collapse. And without that narrative, her sense of superiority had nothing to stand on. Finally, Linda spoke again. "That's a big step, Emily." Her tone held something new. Not politeness, not obligation, respect, real respect. And for the first time, it wasn't forced. 2 days later, I accepted the offer. Training began the following month, and it was harder than I expected. Not physically, but mentally, because learning to lead requires unlearning the instinct to always accommodate. I had spent years prioritizing others' comfort. Now, I had to prioritize fairness, structure, authority. It meant giving instructions instead of waiting for them, making decisions that not everyone liked, holding people accountable, including people older than me. And that shift was uncomfortable at first, but empowering, because every week I felt something growing inside me. Confidence that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. 3 months into training, something unexpected happened. Linda invited me to lunch, just the two of us. No Daniel, no family setting. That alone felt significant. Over coffee, she said quietly, "You've changed." I met her gaze calmly. "I think I've grown." She nodded slowly, then admitted something that stunned me. "I underestimated you." No defensiveness, no excuses, just truth. And hearing that meant more than any apology. Because recognition is more powerful than regret. She continued, "I thought stability came from status, but watching you, I realize it comes from resilience." That was the moment I understood something clearly. My revenge had already succeeded. Not through humiliation, not through confrontation, but through transformation. Because when people who once diminished you begin to see you clearly, the power dynamic shifts permanently, and they can never return to seeing you the same way again. 6 months later, I completed training. On the day I received my assistant manager badge, I thought back to that Christmas dinner, the folded napkin in my hands, the silent humiliation, the moment I felt smallest, and I realized something profound. I hadn't escaped that moment by fighting it. I escaped it by outgrowing it. Because revenge isn't about changing other people. It's about changing your own position so completely. Their behavior no longer defines your worth. But what I didn't know yet was that the next shift in power would come from somewhere I never expected, and it would test everything I had learned about respect. Because sometimes the hardest challenge isn't rising above those who hurt you. It's deciding how to treat them when they finally need you. The call came on a Thursday night, 9:42 p.m. I had just finished reviewing staff schedules at the restaurant when my phone lit up with Daniel's name. His voice sounded different the moment I answered. Tight, controlled. But underneath it, fear. "It's my dad," he said quietly. He collapsed at home. Everything inside me went still. Because no matter how complicated relationships are, emergency changes everything. "What happened?" I asked. "Heart arrhythmia," he replied. Paramedics took him to St. Vincent's S. They're running tests now. I closed my eyes for a second. Not in panic, in focus. "I'm on my way," I said. Hospitals have a unique atmosphere. Bright lights, sterile smells, the quiet hum of machines. But also something heavier, vulnerability. I found Daniel sitting outside the cardiac unit. His shoulders were tense, hands clasped together. He looked up when he saw me. Relief crossed his face immediately. Not because I had answers, but because I had presence. Sometimes that's enough. "How is he?" I asked gently. "They stabilized him," he said. "But they found something else." His voice dropped. Severe coronary blockages. My stomach tightened because I understood what that meant. Surgery, risk, uncertainty. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Daniel said something quietly. "Mom's not handling it well." Of course she wasn't. For people like Linda, control is security, and hospitals strip control away completely. When I walked into the waiting room, I saw her immediately. She sat stiffly in a chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not physically, emotionally. Because fear makes everyone human. She looked up when she noticed me. And for the first time since I had known her, there was no distance in her eyes. Only vulnerability. "Emily," she whispered. I walked over and sat beside her. She took a shaky breath. "They're talking about bypass surgery," she said quietly. Her voice cracked slightly. "I don't know how to handle this." It was the most honest sentence she had ever spoken to me. And in that moment, all past conflicts felt distant. Because life has a way of revealing what truly matters. I reached for her hand, not dramatically, not to erase history, just simply. "I'm here," I said. Her fingers tightened around mine, and I felt something shift between us. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, something deeper. Recognition of shared humanity. Over the next 2 days, everything moved quickly. Doctors recommended triple bypass surgery. High success rate, but still serious, still frightening. Daniel struggled to manage medical discussions. Linda struggled emotionally. Melissa avoided the hospital entirely. And unexpectedly, I became the person holding everything together. Because years of working in service had taught me something invaluable. How to stay calm under pressure. How to listen. How to communicate clearly. How to manage stress without collapsing. Skills that had once been dismissed as just waitressing now became essential. I spoke with nurses, organized updates, translated medical terminology into simple explanations, made sure Linda ate, ensured Daniel slept when he could. And gradually, their dependence on me became undeniable, not out of obligation, but necessity. The night before surgery, Linda asked to speak with me privately. We sat in a quiet hospital cafeteria. The overhead lights cast soft reflections on the empty tables. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I never imagined needing you this way," she admitted quietly. Her honesty surprised me, because pride had always shaped her words. I didn't respond immediately, just listened. She continued. "For years, I thought strength meant control, status, authority." Her voice softened. "But watching you these past days, I see something different." She met my eyes. "Strength is stability, and you have more of it than anyone I know." The words settled heavily between us, because they carried more weight than any apology could. I answered calmly, "We all learn strength in different ways." She nodded slowly, then said something that changed everything. "I was wrong about you. No excuses, no qualifications, just truth." And hearing that didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure. Because recognition matters more than revenge ever could. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Long, exhausting, emotionally draining, but ultimately successful. When the surgeon finally came out and said the words, "He's stable," Linda broke down completely. Years of control dissolving in seconds. She cried openly, and without hesitation, she leaned into me. Not as an authority figure, not as a superior, but simply as family. And in that moment, I understood something important. Power dynamics don't just shift through success. They shift through presence, through reliability, through showing up when it matters most. Charles recovered slowly over the following weeks. Physical therapy, medication adjustments, lifestyle changes. It was humbling for him, because vulnerability forces even the strongest personalities to confront limits. One afternoon, during a quiet hospital visit, he spoke to me alone. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "I misjudged you," he said plainly. "No ceremony, no hesitation. You have integrity and resilience." He paused. "Those matter more than any title." The acknowledgement felt significant, not because I needed his approval, but because it represented a shift in his worldview. The same worldview that had once dismissed me completely. By the time Charles returned home, the Harper family dynamic had changed permanently, not in obvious ways, but in subtle, irreversible ones. They listened more when I spoke. They considered my opinions. They treated me as someone whose presence mattered. Not because of status, not because of money, but because of trust earned through action. And trust is the most powerful form of influence. One evening, weeks later, Daniel said something quietly as we sat together. "You saved my family." I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "I just showed up." Because that's the truth. Revenge isn't always about taking something away. Sometimes it's about proving your value so completely. No one can ever deny it again. But what I didn't know yet was that the next shift in our family dynamic wouldn't come from crisis. It would come from opportunity, and it would test whether respect gained through hardship could survive success. Because sometimes the real challenge begins after the conflict ends. After Charles came home from the hospital, something unexpected happened. Nothing dramatic, no arguments, no confrontations, just silence. The Harper house, once filled with constant commentary and subtle tension, became unusually quiet. Not peaceful, not warm, just cautious. Like everyone was waiting for something they couldn't quite name. At first, I thought it was simply the aftermath of Charles's surgery. Recovery always shifts household energy. People speak softer, move slower, avoid unnecessary conflict. But as weeks passed, I realized this silence wasn't temporary. It was structural because the old hierarchy no longer worked, and no one knew how to rebuild it. Linda no longer gave instructions automatically. She asked instead, "Emily, do you think this would help? Emily, what would you suggest?" Small changes, but profound ones. Because asking requires acknowledging equality. Charles listened carefully whenever I spoke, even when discussing family decisions. Not dismissively, not politely, attentively. And Melissa stopped attending most family gatherings entirely. She claimed work obligations, travel, busy schedules. But the truth was obvious. She couldn't accept the new dynamic because her sense of superiority had depended on mine being below her. Without that contrast, she didn't know how to exist in the same room with me. Daniel noticed it too. One evening, as we drove home after visiting his parents, he said quietly, "It's strange, isn't it?" "What is?" I asked. "How everything feels different now." I nodded slightly. People change when circumstances force them to. He exhaled slowly. "I just didn't realize how much they needed you." His words carried something deeper than gratitude. They carried recognition. Recognition of my role, my influence, my strength. And that mattered more than anything else. Because for years, I had existed on the edges of his family's perception. Now I stood at the center, not by demanding it, but by earning it. Yet beneath this calm surface, something else was shifting. Something no one talked about openly, but everyone felt. The Harper family's financial recovery wasn't complete. Stability had returned, but wealth had not. They had sold assets, restructured debts, reduced expenses, maintained appearances. But the lifestyle they once considered permanent was no longer guaranteed. And that reality created a new kind of tension. Not overt, but constant, like a low hum beneath every conversation. I became fully aware of it one afternoon in late spring. Linda invited me over for tea, just the two of us. We sat in the sunroom, overlooking the garden. She looked thoughtful, almost hesitant. Finally, she spoke. "We've been discussing long-term planning." Her tone was careful, measured. I waited quietly, because experience had taught me something important. People reveal more when you give them space to continue. She sighed softly. After Charles's health scare, we realized how fragile everything can be. Her eyes met mine. "We need to make decisions about the future." I understood immediately. Inheritance planning, asset restructuring, trust revisions. Topics families rarely discuss openly, but essential when facing uncertainty. She continued, "You've become an important part of this family." The words were deliberate, intentional, not casual, and I felt their weight because they represented a fundamental shift from how she once saw me. Then she said something that surprised me. "We want you involved in these conversations." For a moment, I couldn't respond because inclusion at this level was unprecedented. In their world, in their history, it meant recognition not just as Daniel's wife, but as a trusted family stakeholder. I spoke carefully. "That's a significant responsibility." She nodded. "It is." Then she added quietly, "And it's something you've earned." Those words lingered because they reflected a transformation neither of us could have imagined years earlier. From dismissal to reliance to respect. That evening, I thought deeply about what this meant. Not emotionally, strategically. Because inclusion in family financial planning also meant exposure to potential conflict. Different priorities, competing expectations, unspoken tensions. And I knew something from years of observing people. Money doesn't create problems. It reveals them. And the Harper family still had unresolved issues beneath their newly respectful surface, especially Melissa, because her absence from recent gatherings wasn't random. It was avoidance. And avoidance always signals unresolved resentment, the kind that doesn't disappear. It waits until an opportunity emerges. 2 weeks later, that opportunity arrived, unexpectedly. At a Sunday family dinner, Melissa showed up without warning, perfectly dressed, confident, smiling, as if nothing had changed. But her eyes held something sharp, something calculating. During dinner, conversation remained polite. Neutral topics, safe subjects, until Charles mentioned estate planning, just casually, as part of discussing long-term security. That's when Melissa spoke, her voice calm, but edged. I assume the trust structure will remain traditional. The word traditional hung heavily, because everyone knew what it implied. Direct bloodline inheritance, minimal outside inclusion. She glanced briefly at me, then back at her father. We should avoid unnecessary complications. The room fell silent. Not explosive, not confrontational, just tense. Because her message was clear. She wasn't comfortable with my growing role, and she was asserting her position. Subtly, strategically. I didn't respond, because reacting emotionally would only strengthen her argument. Instead, I observed, because silence can be more powerful than defense. Charles spoke calmly. We haven't finalized anything. His tone carried authority, but also caution. Linda looked between us, aware of the underlying tension. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, uncomfortable, because he understood what was happening, and he understood something else too. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about power, position, identity. Melissa's world had always been built on clear hierarchies, and my presence disrupted those structures. Later that night, Daniel asked quietly, "Are you worried about what she said?" I thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "No." He frowned slightly. Why not? Because I had learned something important over the past year. Real power doesn't come from titles, or legal structures, or social expectations. It comes from relationships built on trust. And I had something Melissa didn't, the confidence of her parents, earned through action, not inherited by birth. So I said calmly, because influence isn't something she can take away. He looked at me thoughtfully, then nodded, because he knew it was true. But what none of us realized that night was that Melissa wasn't just expressing discomfort. She was preparing, planning, positioning herself for something much bigger, something that would test every bond in this family, something that would force a confrontation none of us could avoid. Because sometimes, the most dangerous conflicts don't begin with open hostility. They begin with quiet strategy. And Melissa had just made her first move. What she planned next would change everything. Melissa didn't confront me directly after that dinner. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't create scenes. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She became polite. Too polite. The kind of polite that feels artificial, strategic, calculated. She began showing up at family gatherings again, smiling more, asking about my work, complimenting small things. "Emily, you look nice tonight. Emily, the restaurant must be lucky to have you." On the surface, it sounded friendly, but there was always something slightly off in her tone, like she was studying me, measuring reactions, testing boundaries. And I knew something from years in the service industry. People who truly change don't perform it. They live it quietly. Melissa wasn't living change. She was performing it, and performance always has an audience. The question was, who was she performing for? The answer came sooner than I expected. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, at the restaurant, I was reviewing inventory reports in the small office when the front hostess knocked lightly. "Emily," she said, "someone's here asking for you." I stepped out to the lobby and froze for a moment, because standing near the entrance was Melissa, perfectly dressed as always, hair immaculate, posture confident, but her presence there felt wrong. She had never visited my workplace before, not once in 10 years. "What are you doing here?" I asked calmly. She smiled, the same polite smile she'd been using recently. "I was in the area," she said lightly. thought I'd stop by. No one just stops by a busy restaurant at 2:30 p.m. Not someone like Melissa, but I didn't challenge it directly. Instead, I said, "Would you like to sit down?" She nodded. We took a quiet table near the back. I poured water for her. She glanced around the restaurant, taking everything in. The staff moving efficiently. Customers greeting me by name. Managers nodding respectfully as they passed. And I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not admiration, recognition. Because this was a world where I held authority. Where I wasn't beneath her. Where she couldn't control the narrative. She finally spoke. "You've built quite a position here." Her tone was neutral, but loaded. I responded simply, "I've worked hard." She nodded slowly, then reached into her handbag and pulled out a thin folder. She placed it gently on the table. "I wanted to show you something," she said. My stomach tightened slightly, because instinct told me this wasn't a casual visit. I didn't touch the folder yet. "What is it?" I asked calmly. She held my gaze. "Just something you should be aware of." The wording was careful. Not threatening, not aggressive, but unmistakably strategic. I opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, estate planning drafts, trust restructuring proposals, and at the top of the first page, a familiar name. Charles Harper, Family Trust. I read quietly, line by line, and the more I read, the colder my hands felt, because these documents were recent, very recent, drafted within the last 2 weeks. And they outlined something very specific, a proposed amendment, one that would redefine inheritance distribution, one that would shift control back toward direct bloodline beneficiaries. In simple terms, it significantly reduced Daniel's future share and eliminated any indirect marital access, meaning if anything happened to him, I would receive nothing, no protection, no security, no recognition of my role in the family's recovery, just exclusion. I closed the folder slowly and looked up at her. She watched me carefully, waiting, studying my reaction. But I had learned something important. Never reveal emotion to someone seeking leverage. So I spoke calmly. "Why are you showing me this?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because you deserve to know." The words sounded sympathetic, but they weren't. They were calculated. Because what she was really saying was, "You don't belong here. You never did." I asked quietly, "Do your parents know you brought this to me?" For the first time, she hesitated, just slightly, then replied, "They will," which told me everything. These weren't finalized decisions. They were proposals, influenced, encouraged, possibly manipulated. And she was showing them to me, not out of kindness, but as a warning, or a test, or both. I placed the folder back on the table. "And what do you expect me to do with this information?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. She leaned forward. "I think you should understand something, Emily." Her voice remained calm, but the edge returned. Family wealth stays within the family. There it was, the truth beneath her polite mask. She wasn't just protecting assets. She was protecting hierarchy, control, identity. Because in her world, people like me were temporary, replaceable, never equal. I met her gaze steadily. "And what exactly defines family Melissa?" She didn't answer immediately, because she knew this wasn't a simple question. Finally, she said, "Blood." Just one word. Cold, definitive, but also short-sighted. Because she didn't understand something fundamental. Family isn't only defined by blood. It's defined by trust, by presence, by reliability. And those things can't be written into legal documents or erased by them. I stood calmly. "Thank you for showing me this." She blinked slightly, surprised, because she expected anger, defensiveness, fear. Instead, she got composure, which unsettled her more than any argument could. As she gathered her things, she asked quietly, "Aren't you worried?" I answered without hesitation. "No," she frowned. "Why not?" Because the truth was simple. These documents revealed more about her insecurity than about my position. So I said calmly, "Because influence isn't determined by paperwork." She stared at me for a moment, then left without another word. That evening, I sat alone in our living room, thinking, not emotionally, strategically, because Melissa's move revealed something critical. She wasn't just reacting. She was planning, trying to secure long-term control, trying to restore the hierarchy she believed she deserved. But what she didn't realize was that by showing me those documents, she had exposed her strategy too early. And in doing so, she had given me something far more powerful than legal leverage. Information. And information changes everything. Because now, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The real confrontation hadn't happened yet. It was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be subtle. It would be public, decisive, and irreversible. Because Melissa had made one critical mistake. She assumed power came from inheritance. But real power comes from something far harder to control. And soon, she was going to learn that lesson the hard way. I didn't tell Daniel about the documents right away, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I understood something important. Information is power, and timing determines how that power is used. If I reacted immediately, emotionally, Melissa would win, because she wasn't trying to provoke a fight. She was trying to control the narrative. And narrative control begins with forcing someone into a defensive position. I refused to play that role, so instead, I watched, observed, listened, and waited. Because when someone is making a strategic move, they always reveal their next step. It happened 10 days later. At a family brunch Linda hosted, Melissa arrived early, unusually early, before anyone else, which immediately told me something. She wasn't there just for social reasons. She was there for influence. And I noticed something else. She carried a leather portfolio, the same one she'd brought to the restaurant. She greeted everyone politely, smiling, calm, composed. But beneath that composure, I could see tension, like someone preparing for a presentation. And I realized something. She wasn't planning a private maneuver anymore. She was preparing to make her move publicly. Brunch conversation began normally. Light topics, safe subjects. But Melissa waited patiently until the moment she had been watching for. Charles mentioned financial restructuring casually. Just a passing reference, but it was enough. Melissa leaned forward slightly. "I think this is a good time to finalize estate planning," she said calmly. The room went quiet, not awkwardly, but attentively, because she spoke with confidence. Authority, preparation. She opened her portfolio, removed documents, and placed them on the table. "I've worked with a trust attorney," she continued smoothly, "to ensure long-term stability." Her wording was careful, professional, not confrontational, but deliberate. She was framing her actions as responsible stewardship, not self-interest. I watched silently, because this was exactly what I expected. A strategic reveal, but she made one mistake. She underestimated how much the family dynamic had changed. Linda took the documents slowly, read the first page, then looked up. Her expression didn't show approval or agreement. It showed something else, disappointment. "Melissa," she said quietly, "why didn't you discuss this with us first?" Melissa blinked, clearly expecting a different reaction. "I wanted to be proactive," she replied quickly, "to protect the family." Charles spoke next, his voice calm, but firm. Protection doesn't come from secrecy. The tension in the room thickened. Because this wasn't just about legal documents anymore. It was about trust. And Melissa had just revealed she didn't trust them enough to include them in her planning. That realization unsettled them more than the proposal itself. Then came the moment she hadn't anticipated. Linda turned toward me and asked, "Emily, what do you think?" The question landed heavily, because it shifted the entire power dynamic in the room. Melissa's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected my voice to carry weight here. Not publicly, not equally. For a brief second, she looked genuinely shaken. But I answered calmly, not emotionally, not defensively, just clearly. "I think family decisions should be made together. Simple, neutral, unassailable, but powerful. Because it reinforced a principle Melissa had just violated. Transparency." Charles nodded slowly. "Yes," he looked at his daughter. "We decide these things as a family." The word family carried new meaning now. It no longer referred only to blood. It referred to trust, shared experience, mutual reliance, and Melissa knew it. She tried to recover. "I'm not trying to exclude anyone," she said quickly. "I just want to ensure stability." Linda's voice softened, but remained firm. "Stability comes from unity, Melissa." Then she added something that changed everything. "And Emily has been central to keeping this family stable." The sentence hung in the air, because it wasn't just acknowledgement. It was validation, public validation. And in that moment, Melissa realized something she had feared. Her parents' perception of me had fundamentally changed. Not temporarily, not conditionally, permanently. Melissa closed her portfolio slowly. Her composure remained intact, but her eyes revealed something else. Frustration, and something deeper, desperation, because her strategy had failed. Not because her arguments were weak, but because she misunderstood the foundation of power in this family. It wasn't wealth, or legal structures, or inheritance positioning. It was trust. And trust can't be engineered, only earned. After brunch, she left quickly, without lingering conversation, without her usual polite smiles. Just quiet retreat, and I knew something immediately. She wasn't finished. People like Melissa don't give up easily. They recalibrate, rethink, plan their next move. And this time, she would be more careful, more aggressive, because public rejection threatens identity. And threatened identity often leads to escalation. That evening, I finally told Daniel everything. About the documents, about her visit to the restaurant, about the trust proposal. He listened quietly, his jaw tightening slowly. "I can't believe she did this behind our parents' backs," he said. I nodded. "She's not just protecting assets," I replied. "She's protecting her position." He looked at me thoughtfully. "And you're not worried?" I answered honestly. "No," because by now, I understood something completely. Melissa's strategy depended on one assumption. That power came from control of resources. But she failed to see something critical. Real power comes from relationships. And relationships built on reliability can't be undermined by paperwork. He took my hand. "I'm sorry she put you in this position." I squeezed his fingers gently. "It's not a position she put me in," I said calmly. "It's one she revealed, because Melissa's actions hadn't created conflict. They had exposed it. And exposure is the first step toward resolution." What none of us realized yet was that Melissa wasn't just planning another private maneuver. She was preparing something much bigger, something public, something irreversible. Because when quiet strategies fail, some people choose confrontation. And when they do, the outcome changes everything. Soon, Melissa would make her boldest move yet. And when she did, the truth she tried to control for years would finally come into the open for everyone to see. The invitation arrived on a Monday morning. Cream-colored cardstock, embossed lettering, elegant, formal, and unmistakably intentional. Melissa Harper was hosting a charity gala, black tie, at the Regency Ballroom downtown. A high-profile event, attended by business leaders, donors, and social circles that defined her world. The purpose was clear: image, reputation, visibility, everything she valued most. Daniel read the invitation twice, then looked at me. "She's making a statement," he said quietly. I nodded, because I understood something immediately. This wasn't just a charity event. It was a stage, and Melissa had chosen it carefully. Because public perception was the one area she still believed she could control. We arrived at 7:00 p.m. The ballroom shimmered with soft golden lighting. Crystal chandeliers, muted conversations, champagne glasses catching reflections of polished marble floors. Melissa stood near the entrance greeting guests. Poised, confident, impeccable. She looked exactly as she always had, in control. But when her eyes met mine, something flickered beneath that composure. Tension. Because she knew this night wasn't just about charity. It was about narrative, and narratives can change in an instant. The evening progressed smoothly at first. Cocktail hour, polite conversations, introductions. Linda and Charles stayed close to us, their presence steady, protective in a quiet way. But I noticed something else. Melissa watched us constantly, not openly, but subtly, like someone waiting for the right moment to act. Because that's what she was doing. Waiting, timing, preparing. Dinner began at 8:15. Speeches followed. Donor acknowledgments. Projected presentations about community initiatives. Everything carefully orchestrated. Until Melissa stepped onto the stage. The room quieted immediately. She spoke confidently, graciously, thanking sponsors, highlighting charitable goals. Her voice steady, controlled, professional. Then her tone shifted slightly. And tonight, she said, I also want to speak about something deeply personal. My pulse slowed, not accelerated, because I had expected this. She continued, family legacy is about responsibility. The word responsibility hung heavily. And sometimes, difficult decisions must be made to protect that legacy. The room listened attentively, unaware of the subtext, but I understood perfectly. This was her move, her attempt to frame a narrative publicly before anyone else could challenge it. She glanced toward our table and then said it. Our family has recently faced internal challenges. A subtle phrase, but loaded. She wasn't naming anyone, yet she was positioning herself as the responsible guardian, the protector, and implicitly casting others as risks. The audience didn't know the details, but perception doesn't require details, only framing. She was trying to establish one. Linda's hand tightened slightly on the table. Charles's expression hardened. Daniel sat rigidly, and I remained completely still, because reacting now would only validate her framing. Instead, I waited, because I knew something Melissa didn't. She wasn't the only one prepared. She continued speaking, calmly, confidently, until she reached her final statement. Protecting family wealth requires clarity about who truly belongs within its stewardship. There it was, the real message, disguised, but unmistakable. And in that moment, the room's energy shifted, subtly, because while the audience didn't know the context, Linda and Charles did, Daniel did, and most importantly, Melissa had just made a critical mistake. She had taken a private issue and exposed it publicly, which meant public response was now justified. Charles stood slowly, unexpectedly. The movement alone drew attention. He walked toward the stage. The room grew quiet. Melissa's expression faltered for the first time, because she hadn't anticipated this. He took the microphone gently, his voice calm, but firm. Family legacy, he said, is not defined by exclusion. The audience listened intently, because now something deeper than a charity speech was unfolding. He continued, it is defined by trust. He turned toward me and spoke clearly. For the past year, Emily has demonstrated more commitment to this family stability than anyone. The statement landed like a bell. Clear, resonant, irreversible. Linda joined him on stage, her voice steady. Legacy isn't about blood alone, she added. It's about who stands with you when everything falls apart. Silence filled the ballroom. Heavy, unavoidable. Melissa stood frozen, because in one moment, the narrative she tried to control had collapsed. Publicly. Completely. Then Daniel stood. He didn't speak long. Just one sentence. My wife isn't an outsider. He paused. She's the strongest foundation this family has. And with that, the final piece fell into place. Because this wasn't a confrontation. It was a declaration, a public redefinition of family identity. And Melissa had just witnessed her position shift permanently. She stepped back from the microphone slowly, her composure barely holding, because denial was no longer possible. Blame wouldn't work, victimhood wouldn't resonate, and collapse couldn't happen in front of an audience. So she did the only thing left. She remained silent. And silence is the final stage when control is lost. The event continued, awkwardly at first, then gradually returning to normal conversation. But the power dynamic in the room had changed forever. Because what happened wasn't just a family dispute. It was a public redefinition of belonging. And once something is declared publicly, it cannot be undone privately. Later that night, as we left the ballroom, Linda took my hand, her voice soft, but steady. You never fought us, she said quietly. You simply showed us who you were. I met her gaze and replied calmly, I never needed to fight, because the truth was simple. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and undeniable. But even then, one question remained unanswered. What would Melissa do next, now that the world had seen the truth? Because losing control publicly can push people in one of two directions: acceptance or escalation. And we were about to discover which path she would choose. After the gala, Melissa disappeared. Not literally, but socially. She stopped attending family gatherings, stopped responding to casual messages, stopped performing her usual polished presence. And for weeks, no one mentioned her directly. The silence felt different this time. Not tense, not uncertain, resolved, because the power dynamic had already shifted. Publicly, irreversibly. What remained now was personal. It happened nearly a month later. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Linda called me, her voice measured. "Melissa wants to meet," she said. "Not we want, not we need. Melissa, alone." The distinction mattered. Where I asked. "At the house," she replied. "Just us. No audience, no stage, no leverage, just private truth." I agreed, because I understood something. Closure doesn't come from avoiding conflict. It comes from facing it calmly. The Harper living room felt strangely neutral that afternoon. Soft afternoon light filtered through the windows. No decorations, no distractions. Just 4 chairs arranged in a quiet circle. Linda sat quietly, Charles beside her, Daniel slightly behind me, and Melissa across from us. She looked different, still composed, still elegant, but something fundamental had shifted. Her posture wasn't defensive. It wasn't aggressive. It was tired, because control requires constant energy, and she had finally run out. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Melissa exhaled slowly and said the words no one expected. "I was afraid, not angry, not resentful, afraid." The room remained still, because that word changed everything. She continued, "When the financial crisis happened, everything I believed about security collapsed." Her voice was steady, but quiet. "I built my identity on being the one who protected the family's future." She glanced briefly at her parents, and then suddenly, "You were the one holding everything together." Her eyes moved toward me. Not hostile, not cold, just honest. I didn't know how to exist in that new reality. Silence settled, because her words revealed something deeper than conflict. They revealed insecurity, fear of irrelevance, fear of losing purpose, fear of losing identity. She spoke again. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," she said quietly. "I was trying to protect the only role I knew how to have." The admission was raw, unfiltered, and completely unexpected, because for years, she had presented herself as confident, certain, unshakable. But now, she was revealing something else entirely: vulnerability. And vulnerability changes conflict, because it removes the illusion of enemy and replaces it with something more human. I spoke calmly. "You didn't trust that there was space for both of us." She nodded slowly. "Yes." Then she added something even more difficult. "I believed respect was limited, that if you gained it, I would lose it." That sentence held the core of everything, the true root of her behavior. Scarcity thinking, the belief that dignity and belonging are finite. But they aren't. They expand when shared. And I said gently, "Respect isn't a competition." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that now." Charles spoke next, his tone firm, but not harsh. "You hurt this family by trying to control it." Melissa nodded. "I know," Linda added softly. "But we also failed by not recognizing your fear sooner." That acknowledgement mattered, because healing requires shared accountability, not one-sided blame. Finally, Melissa looked directly at me, her eyes clear. "For years, I treated you like you were temporary." She paused, her voice steady, despite the weight of the words. "You weren't temporary." She took a breath. "You were the most permanent thing this family had." The statement landed deeply, because it wasn't just apology. It was recognition. Recognition of reality. And recognition is the foundation of genuine change. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't demand reconciliation, didn't attempt emotional manipulation. She simply said, "I don't expect you to trust me yet." Then she added quietly, "But I want to rebuild that trust." The simplicity of the request made it real, because real change doesn't demand immediate acceptance. It accepts the slow process of repair. I answered calmly, "Trust isn't rebuilt through words." She nodded. "I know." Then I added, "It's rebuilt through consistency." And she understood, because consistency is something no one can fake long term. The conversation ended quietly. No dramatic embraces, no emotional declarations, just something far more meaningful: clarity. Because for the first time, everyone in that room understood the truth. This conflict had never been about money, or inheritance, or power. It had been about identity, belonging, and fear. Later that evening, Daniel asked softly, "Do you think she'll really change?" I thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "Yes." He looked surprised. Why? Because I had seen something undeniable in her eyes. Exhaustion, not from losing, but from pretending. And when people grow tired of pretending, they begin to change. Because authenticity requires less energy than control. Weeks passed, then months. Melissa didn't transform overnight. Change never works that way. But she did something more important. She remained consistent, showing up, listening more than speaking, offering support quietly, without performance, without expectation of praise. And gradually, trust began to rebuild, slowly, naturally, because real change doesn't demand recognition. It earns it over time. One evening, as I watched her laughing with Linda in the kitchen, I realized something deeply important. The greatest revenge isn't humiliation. It isn't dominance. It isn't exclusion. The greatest revenge is transformation. Becoming so stable, so grounded, so undeniable, that the people who once diminished you must change how they see you. Not because you demanded it, but because reality leaves them no other choice. And in that realization, I understood something else. The story wasn't ending with conflict. It was ending with something far more powerful. Peace. Real peace. The kind built not on victory, but on understanding. And that peace would shape the final chapter of everything we had lived through. 1 year after the gala, no one talked about revenge anymore. Not out loud, not indirectly, not even in passing. Because the word no longer fit what had happened. What remained wasn't a story about defeat or victory. It was something quieter, something steadier, something much more permanent: respect. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Families never work that way. There were still disagreements, different opinions, awkward moments, but the foundation beneath those moments had changed. Because now there was balance, and balance changes everything. Linda no longer called to assign tasks. She called to ask how I was doing. Charles asked for my perspective on decisions, not out of obligation, but genuine trust. Daniel stood beside me consistently, not defensively, not apologetically, naturally. And Melissa became something unexpected. Not a close friend, not a distant stranger, something in between. A sister-in-law who had learned the hardest lesson of her life and who never forgot it. One afternoon in early autumn, she and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen after a family dinner. She was rinsing dishes quietly. I dried them, the routine simple, unremarkable, but she suddenly spoke. "Do you know what scared me the most?" I shook my head. She paused. Not losing inheritance. She turned slightly toward me. Losing purpose. Her voice held no defensiveness, just reflection. For years, I believed my value came from protecting something external: wealth, status, control. But when everything changed, I realized something. She met my eyes. "You never protected status." She paused. "You protected people." The sentence lingered between us because it captured the truth more clearly than anything else. I hadn't fought for position. I had shown up consistently, reliably, without calculation, and that had changed everything. Later that evening, as Daniel and I drove home, he said quietly, "You know what's strange?" What I asked. "I don't think about that old dynamic anymore." Neither did I. Because once balance becomes normal, You stop noticing it, like steady ground beneath your feet. You only notice instability when it's gone. And our life now was steady. Not dramatic, not volatile, just stable in the best possible way. At the restaurant, my career continued to grow. I moved from assistant manager to operations manager within 2 years, not because I chased titles, but because I had learned something fundamental. Leadership isn't about authority. It's about consistency. The same lesson that transformed my family relationships. Transformed my professional life, too. Because people trust stability. They rely on reliability. And those qualities create influence naturally. Without force. One quiet evening after closing, I stood alone in the dining room. The lights dimmed, tables neatly arranged, the space peaceful. And I thought back to that Christmas dinner years earlier. The folded napkin in my hands, the silent humiliation, the feeling of invisibility. And I realized something profound. That moment had once felt like the lowest point of my life. But it had also been the turning point, because it forced me to see clearly, to stop trying to earn respect through approval, and instead build it through stability, through self-worth, through quiet consistency. Revenge is often imagined as something loud, dramatic, explosive, but real revenge is quiet. It doesn't destroy others. It transforms you until the people who once diminished you have no choice but to see you differently. Not because you demanded it, but because you became undeniable. One winter evening, nearly 3 years after that Christmas dinner, our family gathered again at Linda's house. The same dining room, the same table, the same holiday lights glowing softly. But the atmosphere was completely different. Warm, relaxed, balanced. Melissa laughed easily. Charles moved slowly, but confidently, after his recovery. Linda sat calmly, no longer trying to control every detail. Daniel reached for my hand beneath the table, and for a moment, I simply looked around, taking it all in. Not triumphantly, not emotionally, just quietly. Because this was what peace looked like. Not perfect harmony, but steady respect. After dinner, Linda handed me a small, wrapped box. I opened it carefully. Inside was a silver bracelet. Simple, elegant, with a small engraved charm. I turned it over and read the words etched into the metal. Strength is quiet. I looked up at her. She smiled gently. Because you taught us that. The moment felt deeply symbolic. Not as a reward, not as an apology, but as recognition. Recognition of the truth we had all learned together. Later that night, after everyone left, Daniel asked softly, "Do you ever wish things had been different from the start?" I thought carefully before answering. No, he looked surprised. Why? Because I understood something now that I couldn't have understood back then. Without conflict, there is no clarity. Without struggle, there is no growth. Without being underestimated, you never discover how strong you truly are. So I said quietly, because we wouldn't be who we are today. And that was the truth. Before we went to sleep, I stood for a moment by the window, looking out at the quiet street, snow falling softly, everything still. And I thought about the girl I had been years earlier, the one who believed respect had to be earned through compliance, the one who stayed silent to avoid conflict, the one who felt invisible. She wasn't weak. She was simply unaware of her own strength. And now, that strength defined everything. If you've listened this far, I want to ask you something. Not about revenge, not about family conflict, but about something deeper. Do you believe respect comes from what people give you, or from what you quietly build within yourself? Because that question changes everything. If this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or treated as invisible, remember this. You don't need to fight for respect. You don't need to demand recognition. You only need to become so steady, so consistent, so undeniably grounded, that the world has no choice but to see you clearly. And when that happens, everything changes, quietly, permanently. And that is the most powerful form of revenge there is. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story spoke to you, Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And before you go, there's another story waiting for you. One about a woman who discovered a hidden clause in her husband's will. That changed everything overnight. You might find yourself in that story, too. Because sometimes the truth that hurts the most is also the truth that sets you free.